So Joko Beck died in 2011, and the sort of eulogy Barry gave at the session following that, he talked a bit about the importance of Joko having been one of the first women Zen teachers, significance of that. And just a phrase which stuck in my mind of that was that he said it was, of all the many important aspects to her teaching, it was not the least important that she'd been a woman. And so I was thinking a little bit about that, about in a wider sense why you might think that would be significant, because it's a fact when Joko began her teaching career, there were very few women Zen teachers, and still many, many more male Zen teachers. And of course, if as a headline we talk about how Joko changed the course of Zen, which she did, it's in terms of psychology. Important to remember that that was very much a pragmatic rather than a theoretical approach, and that what she really did was bring Zen practice as not simply ritual, not simply sitting, but as awareness and as attention into what had traditionally been thought of as private spaces, the home, domestic, or maybe the office environment that you work in. This is actually incredibly significant. She was a mother. She raised children part of the time as a single mother. And that's important too. Having to deal with that awful word, but multitasking, pick it up moment by moment, improvise, invent, whatever's needed at that moment. And I think that was very much an attitude she brought to her Zen and brought to her Zen teaching. But I think that fits also really interestingly with the fact that she had trained as a concert pianist. This aspect of experiencing, our actual experience, which is so important to Joko's teaching. What's really going on right now? And we can talk about that in terms of all the aspects of the body. But if you think about being a pianist, what's important isn't that you just hit the right note. It's the quality of that note. The quality of that note. The actual way that you push the key. Not even simply the volume. It's volume, tone, damping, how it sits in relation to every other note, how your hand is actually working across between the keys. It's totally embodied, and it's totally about the actual result of that, the actual sound. It's not, oh, well, I did it right. Irrelevant. What's important is, what's the actual experience of playing it like that, rather than like that? What's the difference? And when she talks about her own teacher at the conservatoire, it's very much, and we did this basic exercise for days, weeks, months. No, come on, let's get this right. And it's that, well, no, because you're not really listening. It's all about listening. And Zen is totally about listening literally, but listening to all our sense gates of the body. Taste, touch, smell, feel. And of course thought. Piano playing isn't a stupid activity either. You need to bring your intelligence along with everything else and this aspect of experiencing. And so literally having the face of a woman and bringing these different kinds of awareness and intention, and being one of the first, or certain earlier, Western Zen teachers So we have this, in cliche terms, little old lady rather than this inscrutable looking oriental man or this meaningful, wonderful, heroic male Zen teacher. It's very significant. And I think certainly in the early days of Zen teaching in the West, the home environment itself, domestic environment, is seen as a distraction in the sense of you've got teachers coming from the monastic tradition. It's very much very separately gendered, monks, nuns. Practice and monastic ritual is central to this. And how do we do Zen in the West? Well, obviously in the early days nobody actually knows. And I think even not working with ordinary mind, but in other sanghas, other traditions of Zen and beyond Zen to Buddhism generally, there's this often a strong sense that, okay, we're not monks clearly, but, we should try and bring the same kind of intensity and everything which is not about this monastically oriented practice is a distraction. Home life is a distraction. Family life is a distraction. And again, it's that aspect that I think Joko challenged so dramatically by her being, by her presence, by the way that she was beginning to work with students. And not particularly in connection with not particularly in connection with Joko, but Barry pointed up another interesting aspect of this, which is that one of the key Japanese monastic activities is cleaning. What you do, you clean, and then you clean the thing that's being cleaned, just to make sure it's clean, except you knew it was clean anyway, because that's not the point. It's the activity which is the point. And we clean and we clean and we clean and we clean again. Now you can imagine a guy who's used to being a slob on his own or being looked after at home in a domestic environment. The idea that you go on sesshin and do 3 hours cleaning a day, that's a practice. That's a discipline. And as Barry pointed out, for a woman going on sesshin who's had to negotiate time away from her family and the endless rituals of childcare and cleaning, and which she's probably doing after doing her own job outside the house anyway, that's maybe not such a meaningful practice, maybe not such a wonderful insight. So in all these kind of ways, we're changing things. And so, one tiny example, which is Joko when she was living with her student Elizabeth Hamilton, says, Elizabeth always likes to put the washing up bowl the other way up, and I like to put it this way up, and we have endless fights about it. But it's great, it's what we do. Totally unserious. We're both right. We're both, and just bring it home. These little actual concrete embodied examples, which I think are, really important, really wonderful. And contrast that to I wasn't there, but as far as I have no reason to doubt, it's not a true Zen story, but it's one of my favourite Zen stories, which is of a woman who became one of the second generation of Zen teachers, quite a significant figure in her own right, when she was a student in the Sangha with her all-male teachers, obviously, and that they'd gone off to a conference of, turns out basically male Zen teachers. They came back. He says, "Oh, how many women were there?" We were all women. It's this, because in emptiness there is no male, no female. That's the whole deal, when we see beyond gender, when we see beyond sexuality. Except, of course, it's also, this is the era of the beginnings of the move towards equality in the States and in Britain, and it's about the most patronising thing you can think of to say. And it's a slap down, and it's don't bring that stuff in here. this is different, this is separate, this is clean, we're not contaminated by any of that man-women stuff. And in fact, if you think about it, the traditional, well, almost key to enlightenment is ceasing to be in any way a sexual being, because that's all about, well, at its most biological, it's about reproduction, but it's certainly about our engagement, our attachment to the world, desire for the world. And that renunciation, which is the basis of monastic practice, is basically, no, we put that at a different distance. Once I've finished myself as a sexual being, once I've finished myself as a gendered being, I happen to be in the monks' hall rather than the nuns' hall, but that's no big deal. Then I'm kind of ready to step off the wheel and become whatever it is that you think you become if you step off the wheel. And clearly, our practice isn't that. Our practice is the opposite of that. Our practice is about engagement. So, are we really trying to get above and beyond? Does that really have no place within our practice? Well, if we're actually practicing in our whole lives, of course, no escape. Real life. The complexities of my sexual expression, the complexities of my sexuality or lack of it or whatever. The complexities of being a gendered being in a gendered world. So you might think that actually Joko would have talked about men and women quite a lot. In actual fact, she doesn't. She basically just doesn't. And this has perhaps puzzled me a little bit. But then her attitude was always very much just get on with it. We don't spend too much time thinking about anything. We just get on with it. You got a bad relationship? You stay or you go. It's that simple. And of course, in the end, she did go. She left because she was worried about her children. She actually left her marriage, became a science secretary on her own, worked, studied Zen, ended up as one of the major Zen teachers of her age. But it's kind of no nonsense. It's kind of, I've no idea actually of Joko's politics or her faith background, both of which might be quite interesting. But she's always comes across as incredibly no nonsense. And in that sense, maybe what we can think of as a slightly, well, restraint was an important word for her, almost that Protestant Puritan tradition. Again, that may just well have been her. But I think it's also quite interesting the time that she's actually doing this in the wider context. This is the 80s, the 1990s. It's the era of Thatcher and Reagan and beyond. It's the era of, well, there's Fukuyama's famous book, The End of History. And the Cold War ends, the Berlin Wall comes down, capitalism's won, there is no alternative. And we're all, for the most time in history, encouraged to think of ourselves as entirely separate individual human beings. That kind of mutual care, social democratic consensus which existed across Europe and to a large extent as well, lesser extent, but still significantly more than it had ever been in the United States as well, collapses. And what we have is, individualism. What we have is universal competition. And in a way, just thinking about my practice, just thinking about, my practice, my family, my job, my world, it seems to fit with that. But then, not contradicting that, but just, oh, so you mean that Joko's really about, at the end of the day, just going off and practicing away from everybody else? No, because you have these stories about students saying, well, oh, we ought to, we could probably raise some money and go and get another practice centre in the mountains where it's really peaceful, really quiet, like the other ones, like Tassajara and the rest of those ones. That'd be great, wouldn't it? And Joko's saying, no, we're practicing here in the middle of San Diego in this very average neighbourhood with all its, perfectly normal, not particularly salubrious social problems, as Barry says, it's neighbourhood crack den. Real life, complicated life. We're not trying to evade that. We're not trying to escape that. And so the picture's always complicated. For Joko, it does, though, stay very much with the immediacy of this experience and this immediate relationships. So she wasn't a great one for writing theory, and when she did found the Ordinary Mind Zen School, it was deliberately as a loose association of teachers, rather than no, this is the party line, you believe this, you practice in this way. Not at all. And one of the characteristics is that all the teachers are still, we go our own way. Certainly, huge respect to Joko, huge respect to Barry, but yeah, we're not tied to any party line. And so we get back to the same kind of little knotty range of issues, or knotty for me anyway, because, well, let's put it this way. If emptiness is the foundation of our view of the world, Zen view of the world, if we see emptiness as non-separation, then if we're not separate from everything else, and not separate from everybody else, every other being, then surely that's the major invitation you could ever find. And originally I thought, well, mate, obligation? Well, no, obligation is exactly wrong, because it's not like there's a me over here and all these other beings and I should. That's absolutely what it's not. It's this invitation to allow a sense of connection with all the beings who we encounter in every register, every level, whether that's birds, wild animals, plants, whatever, or other human beings. And we do encounter them, and we do encounter ourselves as gendered beings every time we meet another being. We're all assigned male or female at birth. For some of us that works fine. For others of us, it really doesn't. We might try and withdraw from the whole system. We might do that as a specific questioning, or we might feel that we want to actually well, this is to go far too far, but we might feel that we belong somewhere else. But this is all our experience, our shared experience. And just a tiny trivial way into this. I've been working on this commentary on the third precept, which is about desire, it's about sexuality, it's inevitably therefore about gender too. So this is just a paragraph from it. I walk down the road. It's night time and the street lights have come on. I pass by a woman who's subtly but clearly uneasy about meeting my gaze, about sharing this most simple aspect of mutual recognition. I don't want my presence here to make her feel uncomfortable in any way. uncomfortable just for actually being here, out in public space, going about her own business. Her discomfort makes me feel uncomfortable to be here. In not meeting my gaze, does she assume that simply by her being a woman, I'll then assume that she owes me some kind of service, if only a smile? A smile that, if exchanged, might be seen as, by her, as offering me some kind of invitation. Perhaps she has her keys in her hand, pointed outwards. Perhaps she has pepper spray or a rape alarm. I don't want her even to have to think about taking these precautions, or for anyone to feel that it's right that she should. This version of staying safe limits her actions, her thoughts, her feelings, her sense of self itself. So what she and I share from our very different perspectives is an awareness of the threatening and potentially violent sexual component of our being differently gendered as man and woman as we meet here in public space. It's taken many generations for us to begin collectively to admit, let alone articulate, that there even is a problem. And for women finally to feel able to claim the right to occupy this space without fear. A right very far from being realised. I don't want to be a part of the problem. I don't want there to be a problem. And so I wrote that as kind of a hinge, because that's what it's like being a guy out on the street. And that's my actual lived experience of the discomfort, of seeing the discomfort of another being. How do we respond to that? How do we respond to that? Which kind of opens up onto the big question of, what are we doing here? Why are we actually here? We're sat here of a Tuesday evening. Have we come here just to, and I'm not saying any of this is wrong, unwind, feel comfortable, share amongst friends? Have we come to be challenged, or have we come to be reassured, or maybe a bit of both, maybe neither, maybe another direction entirely? And do we want to talk about these things? Are they relevant? Are they important to how we are in the world? We don't want to turn our back on the world. We don't want to look away from things. But if we are going to talk about these things, how are we going to do it? What's the most appropriate way of doing that together, so that we can hear each other's voices, so that we can think things through? Again, some of the places we might want to go or need to go might be deeply problematic. Even discussing a simple thing like, or a seemingly simple thing like, the difference between the way that men look at women and women look at men. Well, that's complicated enough before we get onto the really hard stuff. And what made me feel that I absolutely needed to say something at this point was reading the latest report, which may or may not lead to legislation in the UK, about partial strangulation during sex, and the fact that whereas this was relatively unheard of 30 years ago, now it seems that 30% of younger women, it's that steep curve again, under 30, particularly if you're kind of college, university age, have experienced and might routinely experience, often expect to experience strangulation during sex. That's just how it is. Well, okay. So how do we fit that with my not even meeting this poor woman on the street. How do these things fit together? And are we going to be appalled or demand action, or are we going to try and follow things through? And what are the deeper connections here? And I really think there are deeper connections, but is this an appropriate space in which to begin to discuss them? That's really for us to decide, and for us as a Sangha to decide. And, if you're watching this later, or listening to it on audio, watching it on YouTube, then, heaven's sake, I'm interested in what you think about this. There's a level at which all of these things connect up. As I said, for me, the bottom line is emptiness, and how that implies about how we live together, how we share this world. And for me, this is absolutely different instances, different specific contexts, whether we're talking about race, whether we're talking about colonialism, whether we're talking about ecocide, whether we're talking about misogyny. And there are ways we can discuss this, and names that we can discuss this, and to an extent, well, it's how do we talk about one thing? How do we limit the conversation because it connects outwards instantly? But if we do that, how do we avoid getting lost? Lost in abstraction, lost in thought. And that's where my meeting on the street gives this little experiential clue for me to start with. Yeah, start just with that experience. But then if I remember back, I can remember many instances where I could have acted differently, should have acted differently. But then beyond my actions, how can we frame our actions as a culture, as a society? And again, without getting lost, without stepping back, dissociating, I think this needs to be the case. It's the biggest cliche on the planet, but it's complicated because, yeah, it is complicated. So tell me what you think. Let's have a conversation about whether we have a conversation, and about what shape that conversation might take, and how that relates to the intimate practice of Zen on the cushion, doing the washing up, being with another person, not separate with all of these.